Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Karl-Anthony Towns makes his return tonight against the Atlanta Hawks, plus more ownership news, specifically related to Tim Connelly and also where are the Wolves most likely to end up in the playoffs. We'll talk about all the scenarios as we head into the weekend. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy Timberwolves game day, the second to last Wolves regular season game of the year. And I said that weird. Second to last regular season game for the Wolves this season. And we're going to look ahead to the playoffs today. Like, where are the Wolves going to land? First, second, or third in the West? We'll kind of handicap all the different possibilities, the possible opponents, all that stuff today. I want to start with some Cat stuff, some ownership and Conley stuff. We'll close with the Hawks matchup. We have a ton to get to today. So let's get into it here. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. And a quick reminder about the postcast. Of course, we follow and cover your team every day right here on the show, but also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. We'll give you instant episodes after every single Wolves game, right after the game on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. Luke Inman and Jack Borman will break down the game that has just finished, and then the audio from the postcast comes right here to this feed. So be sure to check that out after Wolves Hawks tonight. All right. Let's talk Karl-Anthony Towns. My guess earlier this week on like Monday when it started being reported that Wolves were hoping he'd be back. Actually, it might have been a Sunday report that he'd be back in the regular season. My prediction at that time was that Friday was a game to target, right? They weren't, as soon as like Tuesday seemed real quick, right? Because he was cleared for contact they said he was scrimmaging Sunday. So like Tuesday's quick. Wednesday was in Denver at altitude against Jokic. That wasn't going to happen. Sunday is the last day of the regular season and a matinee game, which is weird. So Friday made sense. And my guess is it just kind of depends on how things go Friday, whether or not he plays Sunday. My hunch is if there's nothing to play for Sunday, if we know what's happening with the Wolves and, regardless of how Friday goes, I think Cat probably plays some of the game Sunday, but is, just everybody plays shorter minutes, right? Because no matter what happens, you're not going to play for at least 5 to 6 days as a top 3 seed, right? Because of the play-in tournament now. So you're not going to play until that next weekend. So why add another day onto that? Get everybody a little bit of work on Sunday, even if the game doesn't mean a whole lot, but trim those minutes back, right? So all that to say, Karl-Anthony Towns should be playing tonight. He's listed as questionable, but both Shams Charania and Adrian Wojnarowski have reported that the Wolves expect Karl-Anthony Towns to play on Friday night. We don't know anything about minutes restriction, et cetera. We talked to the Minnesota basketball party on Wednesday. What should this thing look like? If he's not on a restriction, we all kind of agreed he should start. Ron Johnson thought he should come off the bench regardless. Jack mentioned, if he is on a minutes restriction, bringing him off the bench does make some sense. I'd be surprised that if he's on a real minutes restriction, it also wouldn't surprise me if they're just a little bit cautious because why not? Right? Like there's the upside to get him on the floor now is to try and reintegrate him, get his feet wet a little bit, but him playing 20 to 25 to 30 minutes, like there's not really a big difference at this point. They know they're a top 3 seed, right? And we'll talk in a little bit here about the seeding, but the risk reward here, you don't want that to get all out of whack. So excited to see Cat back on the floor here. Hopefully tonight, that's the plan at least. That's being reported. The other piece of news that came out on Thursday was Shams Charania had a report that Tim Connelly has an opt-out in his deal after this season. And the plan there was that it would align with the ownership shift. And if for whatever reason he wanted out because of whatever did or didn't happen with the ownership shift, he'd have the ability to get out after 2 years on his 5-year deal. I do recall at the time it was reported there was some sort of an option or an out for Conley back when he was initially hired. Well, it's apparently, according to Shrani, it's this offseason. And of course, things have gone completely south with the ownership transaction. Now, this also could be something that's coming out from the Conley side of things because now all the headlines are, and this is the way Shams framed it, was the architect of the top 2 seeds, likely top 2 teams in the West, and last year's NBA Finals champion and a woebegone franchise that's likely to win their first playoff series in 20 years. The architect of those teams may choose to be a free agent this offseason, right? And then what does that mean? The Wolves, he might just get an extension, right? Because of this story. It's like it happens all the time in college, right? Like, didn't PJ Fleck just recently, the UCLA offer leveraged him into a raise and an extension with Minnesota once again? Like, that keeps happening. It could be a little bit like that. I'm not saying it's like malicious. It's just how the game is played. And I don't know this to be the case, but it would make sense if it came from Connolly's camp in some way, shape, or form, his agent maybe, where if he gets more security and more money out of this, I mean, why would he want to leave the Wolves? He's got Anthony Edwards, right? The ownership situation's sticky, sure, but he's undoubtedly had to work with Glenn Taylor, Mark Lowry, and Alex Rodriguez over the last 2 years. So I would be really surprised if Connolly was like, yeah, you know what, I'm out, because you have Anthony Edwards, you have assets. I know that he traded a bunch of picks, but like they've got a first round pick this year, albeit in a not great draft. You've got, obviously you could trade Cat or Nas this offseason. Like there's tons of, the Wolves are not in a bad spot, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And while the ownership situation does affect the president of basketball operations, probably certainly more than say it would affect the players, he's already worked with them for a couple of years. And Lowry and Rodriguez were the ones that wanted to hire him, and they're still 40% owners. So even if it's a little bit uncomfortable, the day-to-day shouldn't be impacted all too much for Connolly. And I think almost anybody, almost any executive would do almost anything to have Anthony Edwards as their piece to build around over the next several years. So I would be shocked if Connolly actually opted out and went somewhere else. Is this leveraging to get a even bigger contract? I would say that's very likely. And I would say it's pretty likely that it happens, right? I mean, now I don't know how easily or how easy or how difficult those decisions are when you have a fractured ownership situation. But I guess if Glenn's this roughly 60% stakeholder still, then I mean, it's up to him, right? Like I'm sure there's some sort of, like, I believe that decision would just be up to him. If he wants to extend or give a raise to Tim Connelly, he would be able to do that. And Glenn himself said he wants to stick around as the majority owner because the team is good, right? So I would be pretty surprised if this became anything. I think it's pretty likely that Connolly either gets an extension and or a raise and or nothing, but doesn't leave, because why would you? Why would you leave an up-and-coming team roster and superstar like Anthony Edwards? It just doesn't make any sense. I want to spend a good chunk of time here on the playoff scenarios. There were some games on Thursday night, none that really had any direct bearing on what the Wolves seeding will be, but also who plays Friday, who plays Sunday. Well, I guess everybody plays twice, Friday and Sunday, in terms of Wolves, Nuggets, Thunder. But what the schedules look like, the tiebreakers as we stand today, what's the most likely scenario for the Wolves. So we'll do all that, and then we'll preview Wolves Hawks. We haven't seen the Hawks in a very long time. So all that's upcoming next here on the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Stitch Fix. You know that instant confident boost that you get from an outfit that makes you look really good? That's exactly what you can get with Stitch Fix. Easily upgrade your wardrobe this year with a professional stylist that helps you find new on-trend favorites that will work for you. You just give your stylist your size, style, and budget preferences. You can order boxes whenever you want and however you want with no subscription required. Plus, they'll send 5 just for you pieces, plus outfit recommendations and pro styling advice. You just keep what works and you send back the rest. Your stylist will always send just right pieces and the fit will be on point. It's like they have Style ESP. I have no idea how they do it, but trust me, they're just going to get you. Stitch Fix makes it all so easy. I don't like to shop. If you don't like to shop, they're going to save you that time and effort. Plus, you can get outfits that make you look and feel really good. If you don't love something, like I said, you just send it back. Shipping, returns, and exchanges are always free. Style that makes you feel as good as you look. Get started today at stitchfix.com/lockedon. That's stitchfix.com/lockedon. Stitchfix.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is also brought to us by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Instead, just make the switch, make the shift, make the switch, whatever, to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. So playoff scenarios. The Timberwolves enter play, like not the Timberwolves play, but entered games on Thursday with the Wolves tied with OKC for the second spot in the West. The Wolves have the head-to-head tiebreaker. If you look at the ESPN standings, it's got the Thunder ahead of the Wolves, but that's not right. The Wolves would be the second seed if the playoffs started right now. The Thunder would be third by virtue of the conference record tiebreaker, right? So it's head-to-head, which is tied, division record, which is tied, conference tiebreaker goes to the Wolves. The Wolves have a better conference record than both OKC and Denver, for whatever that's worth, which it, I guess, only matters over OKC. So if the playoffs started today, the Timberwolves would be the number 2 seed, and they would host, of course, the 7 seed. The 7 seed would be the winner of the Suns-Kings matchup if the playoffs started today. Okay, got that? So the Denver Nuggets have a very easy remaining 2 games. They play Memphis and San Antonio. I'm looking to double check which order they play those teams in. They're at San Antonio on Friday night, and then they're at Memphis for a matinee on Sunday. If Denver loses one of those 2 games and the Timberwolves win both of their games, then the Timberwolves would get the number 1 seed. Oh, no, I take that back. That would be a 3-way tie, wouldn't it? If OKC didn't lose. So OKC would also need to lose a game. All right, so let's say this again. So the way the Wolves get the number 1 seed is if the Wolves beat Atlanta on Friday and beat Phoenix on Sunday, and Denver loses one of their last 2 games against the Grizzlies and Spurs, and OKC loses one of their last 2 games, which is Milwaukee on Friday night and Dallas on Sunday afternoon. So it's pretty likely OKC, I don't want to say likely, there's a decent chance OKC loses one of those 2 games. There's a decent chance the Wolves win their last 2 games. But Denver losing to both or to one of Memphis or San Antonio is tough. That's how the Wolves would get the number 1 seed. If they end up in a 3-way tie, so if the Wolves win their last 2, OKC wins their last 2, and Denver loses one, then OKC actually gets the 3-way tiebreaker, which is very confusing. I don't want to get too in the weeds on it, but that's what would happen. If both teams, or if all 3 teams win out, the Wolves would get the 2 seed. If all 3 teams split their remaining 2 games, the Wolves would get the 2 seed. So that's still right now the most likely scenario. The only other way would be if Denver loses both their last 2 games. So if they lose both against San Antonio and Memphis, then the Wolves would get the number 1 seed. That seems pretty unlikely. So still the most likely scenario is for the Wolves to finish in second. The weird thing is that the 6 through, technically the 6 through 9 seeds are kind of still in flux, but really it's the 6 through 8. Well, no, not really. Actually, as I record this, Sacramento's playing, and they're losing to the Pelicans. So if that score holds and the Pelicans win, then the Pelicans have the inside track. They would have a full game lead on the Suns for the 6th seed. The 6th seed, of course, plays the 3 seed. The Pelicans are the team I am most afraid of in the first round of the playoffs. Phoenix is the team I'm second most afraid of. Those are the 2 teams that the Wolves are most likely to face as of right now. Right? We know it's not going to be Dallas. Dallas is kind of locked into that either 4 or 5 seed. The Clippers and Mavs are basically locked in. Not basically, they are locked into the 4-5 game. The Clippers and Mavs are. So it's the Pelicans or Suns, or it could be the Kings who are in the 8th seed for Minnesota. Those are actually probably my 3 least favorite matchups. And I said this, you go back to like November. And I talked at the time, I was like, you know what? I don't mind their matchup against Denver. OKC's fine. I like them against the Clippers and the Mavs. And clearly they've proven to play the Lakers and Warriors really well this year. The Wolves have. But the Pelicans, Suns, and Kings are my least favorite potential matchups for Minnesota, and they're going to get one of those three in the first round. Of those three, the Kings would be my pick, and that's still a feasible possibility, right? They're losing right now, as I said, to the Pelicans. The Kings, I guess, could still fall to 9, and then it would be Lakers, Suns in the 7-8 game, which is very possible. This is a really hard thing to try and, with these 2+ games remaining for these teams. But the moral of the story is it's going to be one of those three, right? It's going to be the Pels, the Suns, or the Kings. We'll dig more into those matchups once we get a better beat on it. If you're the Wolves, the only real advantage to being third is your opponent throughout next week, and you can prep for one single opponent. However, I would rather not know between the Suns and Kings than know that it's the Pelicans. Zion terrifies me because of the way he dominated the Wolves twice. And while I do think officiating, since the Wolves play the Pelicans, there's less fouls being called, and in the playoffs, there generally are less fouls called. There's too much variance in a Zion matchup, and I'm not here for that. I don't want the Wolves to have to deal with that in the first round. The other advantage, at this point, we know the Wolves can't face the Nuggets until the conference finals because they'll be on the opposite side of the bracket. The second and third seed are on the opposite side of the bracket as the 1 seed. So say the Wolves finish second, say they play the Suns or the Kings in the first round and they win, they'll face the winner of the Thunder-Pelicans matchup if the Pelicans finish 6th. So, fine, if you got to deal with Zion in the second round, fine. But it's, the Thunder are probably going to beat the Pelicans in the first round, although that's a pretty interesting matchup in its own right. The Wolves would not have to face the Nuggets until the conference finals, and the Nuggets would have to get through the Clippers or Mavs in the second round at that point as well. Now, if they get the 3 seed, it's the same thing, right? Because the Thunder are 2 and the Wolves are 3, the Wolves would face the Thunder in the second round. So that's the most likely scenario right now is the Wolves face OKC in the second round and then Denver in the conference finals. But I could see the Pelicans beating either the Wolves or the Thunder. I don't think the Suns or the Kings or the Lakers or the Warriors have a legit shot at beating the Thunder or the Wolves. I think it's the Pelicans that are the biggest threat to both those teams because of their ceiling with Zion, with Brandon Ingram, with CJ McCollum. There's just a higher ceiling with that Pelicans team. And with relative health, I mean, that's a tough playoff opponent, to be sure. It really, really is. And if I'm the Wolves, I don't want that matchup. I just don't. And it's been a minute. And the Wolves also struggle with Jonas Valanciunas too. That's not a good matchup for Minnesota either. He's always seems to dominate, well, not completely dominate, but mostly dominate the Wolves when they face off against him. So it's not my favorite matchup. We've got plenty of time to dissect that further here if that becomes the matchup. But yeah. Anyway, we'll talk more about that on Sunday's show or on Monday's show, I guess. And obviously the postcast Friday night and then also Sunday following the Wolves Suns. By that time, we'll know after the Wolves Suns game on Sunday who Minnesota is going to face off against, or at least we'll know if they're the 3 or they're the 2, right? Because if they're the 2 or the 1, then you got to wait for the play-in to play out. So anyway, lots more to come on that. I want to close today by looking at the Wolves-Hawks matchup. We have not seen Atlanta since game 3 of the regular season. Remember that? It was a debacle. We'll talk a little bit about it, not too much because it's a rough one to talk about. We'll talk a little about the last time these teams faced off and what to expect in this game. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and in the NHL. Plus, baseball is now in full swing. We're more than a week, actually almost 2 weeks into the baseball season. And FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. The Wolves right now on FanDuel are 12.5-point favorites on Friday night against Atlanta. Atlanta's lost 4 straight, and they're locked into the last play-in spot, the 10 spot in the Eastern Conference, and they're 8 games under 500. It's crazy. 12.5-point favorites for Minnesota Friday night in what will likely be Cat's return to the floor. And then, of course, Chris Finch, second right now in Coach of the Year odds. Naz Reid, second in 6 Man of the Year odds. Lots of stuff to look at prop bet wise over there as well. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockdown and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, so last time the Timberwolves faced the Atlanta Hawks was way back in mid-October, and it was a 14-point loss. This was a game Minnesota led by 7 at the end of the first quarter. They led by 19 at halftime, but they were outscored by 19 points in the third quarter alone. DeJounte Murray had, I think, 22 points in the quarter. DeJounte Murray had what was tied for a career high 41 points in that game. And all of a sudden, Minnesota, like this vaunted defense, this was like one of I don't know, 5 or 6 games. Like, I mean, you could talk about this, not the Nuggets game, but what was the game they just barely won on Tuesday night against Washington. The defense was atrocious for stretches. The first Phoenix game back in November, this Atlanta game, like small handful of games where the defense was really, really bad. And I mean, even early in this game, right? The Wolves had a 19-point lead at halftime. The Hawks had 60 points at halftime in this game. The Hawks are like, they're not an offensive juggernaut. They ended up 10th in offensive rating. But like, for the Wolves to give up that many points against Atlanta this early in the season, it was a real red flag, right? Remember the sky was falling. It was after the 1-2 start, losses at Toronto and at Atlanta. It was really, really a terrible start to the season. Atlanta straightened themselves out midway through the year, and now most recently have lost 4 games in a row. They lost to Charlotte last time out by a single point. They're now 36-44, 8 games below 500, but they're locked into the 10 spot in the Eastern Conference. And they already know they're going to be I guess they're 2 games behind the Bulls, so I don't know what the head-to-head is. So they're going to finish 9 or 10. They're in the 9-10 game. They're very likely locked into the 10 spot, but they're going to take on the Bulls in the first play-in game. I guess the first game of the play-in tournament here on, what day is that? Tuesday, I think. So Atlanta doesn't technically have anything to play for other than a rhythm, other than getting themselves into a rhythm. They've also been banged up. I mean, everybody is at this point in the season, but they've had, like, Jalen Johnson's been out. DeJounte Murray didn't play last time out. I think he played a ton of minutes the game before that. I think it was an overtime loss. Onyeka Okongwu's been out. He should be back soon. So they've been really banged up, and there's likely still going to be some guys out in this game. But this matchup for Minnesota, it's actually like Atlanta is, what did I say, 10th in offensive rating. They're second to last in defensive rating. The Wolves hung, 120, 113 in a loss on Atlanta back toward the beginning of the season. But offensively, Atlanta's a tough matchup. They're 8th in pace. They are 9th in three-point rate, and they're 13th in free throw rate. It's a relatively efficient offense, and they play fast. Defensively, like I said, they're really bad. They're second to last in defensive effective field goal percentage. They give up the shots. Whatever you want to take, they'll give those shots up. They also are not a good rebounding team on the defensive end of the floor. They've done a good job on the offensive glass this season. But a lot of that is like, it's Clint Capella playing volleyball. It's Onyeka Okongwu when he's healthy, but he's been hurt. Sadiq Bey's been a big piece for them as well. So this is this is not an ideal matchup for Minnesota. They should win, obviously. Like I said, they're 12.5-point favorites. You got to look, I mean, DeJounte Murray, if he plays, DeJounte Murray and Trae Young in the backcourt, in theory, the Wolves have enough length to stay in front of those guys and to make their lives difficult. And, neither one of them is quite as good of a three-point shooter as maybe their reputation. They're both just a shade over league average, and it's much more about volume shooting than anything else. But with the length of Jaden McDaniels and Nickeil Alexander-Walker especially, and the overall team defense the Wolves play, as long as they can avoid fouling, this is a reasonable matchup for Minnesota. I'm curious to see how they handle the constant pick and rolls on the perimeter. I could see them switching almost everything, but you don't want Rudy on an island against Trae Young. Trae Young's going to throw his body into any big that's near him and try and draw that foul. So it'll be interesting. It'll be a really interesting matchup. And again, both teams have something-ish to play for because they're gearing up for the playoffs, and the Wolves obviously still are hoping to get the 1 or the 2 seed in the West. But it's not like a do or die type situation. So we'll see which team shows up ready to play early. I have a feeling the Wolves will, because the bad taste after the Denver game and also the energy and the emotion of having Cat back as well. So I have a feeling the Wolves will get off to a pretty good start in this game. 12.5 is an aggressive line, though. I don't know that I would take that. I think I would probably take the Hawks and the points, and the Wolves probably win this thing by a couple of possessions, maybe 3 possessions, I'd say, because I think it'll be a relatively comfortable win for Minnesota. Last time the Wolves played them, I mentioned DeJounte Murray had 41. They also gave up, Trae Young had 24 on 22 shots, was 1 of 7 on threes. Nobody else on the Hawks had more than 16 points. And Clint Capella only played 23 minutes, had 2 points, 5 rebounds. He did have 5 blocks in that game. For the Wolves, Ant had 31 on 21 shots. Cat had 16 and 10, but only 1 made 3. And Gobert was just 3 of 7 shooting, but he got to the line 11 times and had 14 and 13. So a lot of numbers in this game. The Wolves, of course, looked a little different off the bench. I mean, Shake Milton played 17 minutes, had 10 points, probably one of his better games in Wolves uniform against Atlanta in that game, made a couple of threes. I don't remember Shake Milton making more than 2 threes his whole time in a Wolves uniform. So 2 threes in one game against Atlanta, I don't remember that at all. Nikhil only played 13 minutes in that game. Actually, the least amount of rotation minutes, least amount of minutes of anyone in the Wolves rotation of the 9 guys that were in the rotation at the time. So it's a different world now than it was back in October when these teams faced off last. So pretty interesting matchup. It's not my favorite one for the Wolves, but clearly a game they should win. They have more talent than the Hawks do. And, we'll be able to have a better sense after this game and after the Nuggets take on the Spurs and after the Thunder take on the Bucks on Friday night, what the most likely scenario is for the Wolves as we head into play on Sunday. All 30 teams playing on Sunday afternoon too, by the way. All right. That's all we have for you today. Of course, as I mentioned, the live postcast on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube following Wolves Hawks on Friday night. Luke and Jack will have that for you. Of course, if you can't watch the game live or you're not going to be at the game, you can always listen on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves. You'll hear Alan Horton on the Hometown Call. Again, search Minnesota Timberwolves on the SXM app on SiriusXM to listen to Alan Horton call Wolves Hawks. Of course, I'll be back on Monday. At that point, we'll know if the Wolves are the 1, 2, or 3 seed. And if they're the 3 seed, we'll know who their matchup is. Likely the Pelicans or potentially the Suns still could get up to 6. Unlikely that the Kings would. And if they're the 1 or the 2, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see who their opponent's going to be in the first round. So once that's all hashed out, we will do a crossover, at least one crossover episode with the Locked On hosts of whatever team the Wolves have in the first round next week. Last year it was like, the Wolves had they had the Lakers, then they had the Thunder. Is that what it was? Lakers, Thunder last year? Yeah, Lakers, Thunder, and then the Nuggets. So it was a whirlwind of crossover episodes last season. And, this year the Wolves aren't in the plan. So it'll be one crossover next week, maybe 2 episodes, but the same, Locked On host that we'll talk to next week, depending on how things shake out. We'll be right into playoff games by this time next week. Exciting stuff. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including on YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A reminder that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Remember, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.